Alrighty, yeah, شيء Mariah Tso ينشيا بلغانا نشله أبكي دنا توهدليني باششين بلغانا داشتشي do look sa dashanale. Hi everyone. My name is Mariah. I'm a GIS specialist with the Bunch Center for African American Studies and a team member, as Yo mentioned, with Million Dollar Hoods. I'm a cartographer, a map maker, and today I'm here to talk to you about unsettling maps. But first, since we're making maps here the next couple of days, whether you're seasoned mappers or new beginners, I thought it would be a good idea to start with a question. What is a map? Well, a common definition is a map is data plus location. Data meaning stored information, often proxy for the real world. Location meaning space. This is the spatial element, the question of where. Where are you going? Where have you been? Where are you now? So if that's our formula, I love to test this theory and start with a kind of quiz. So either in the chat or quietly to yourself, or if you want to shout out, the question is, which one of these, A through F, do you think are traditionally recognized as maps or GIS? Here's C.
The survey in the room, which is map? C.
C.
Okay, C then. Any other map?
A.
See a couple of folks say C, D, and E.
E.
E, all right. D. I vote for F.
Yeah.
I vote for all.
Aha, that's the answer. The answer is all of them. But traditionally speaking, a lot of folks only see C, quote, the world political map, as a map. But why is that? What are all of these items after all? So A shows how to move through places during the Jim Crow era. B is actually a map of coastlines as a carving, which is very useful considering they float and can be read in the dark. C is a so-called world political map, which personally I find boring and frighteningly unimaginative, but more on that later. And D are dot paintings from the indigenous people of what they call Australia. They tell location stories across the physical and location and spiritual planes. E is a map for sea navigation from the indigenous people of what they call Marshall Islands. And F is my personal favorite. It is Cisna's waggle dance on how to find different flower patches. So clearly all of these items talk about location or geography. They have data or information. They are ordered, organized in a particular way. There's a system. But why are they not typically called GIS? Why are some forms of knowledge considered data and others aren't? Is it that we think of maps as inherently scientific and technical? Well, wait a minute. What exactly is a scientific truth? What has objectivity meant historically speaking? To investigate this, I'd like to take some notes from some feminist critiques of maps, which starts with examining something called the scientific male gaze. So we have this idea of a disembodied scientist. The so-called disembodiment produces unbiased knowledge, and that this process is linked to power and the location of the observer. So this is the power of the gaze, the power to look. Historically, this power lies with heterosexual white men, and modern science, rooted in these Western or Eurocentric traditions, positions the single gaze as objective and universal. By contrast, this positions other ways of knowing, the positions of other observers as non-objective, irrational, and partial. So effectively, this disempowers the gazes of women, colonial subjects, elderly, children, sexual minorities, and so on, creating a clear divide between those who have the power to make claims to truth, authority, and power. This establishes hierarchy, where certain knowledge and points of view have more value than others. And in Western culture or Eurocentric culture, this is often based on binaries and dichotomies such as scientific, non-scientific, male, female, subject, object, reason, feeling. Can you think of other binaries that function in a similar way? Perhaps qualitative and quantitative? What about human and non-human? So thinking back to the quiz, why is it that traditionally speaking, only C, the world's political map, is viewed as a map? Why are the other knowledge systems represented relegated to spheres such as mythology, folklore, folk art, not even fine art, artifact or craft instead of technology and science? How does that determine which knowledge systems or gazes hold authority? Why are humans the only ones who have maps and technology? And what are the consequences of viewing something from just one universal perspective? So let's unpack some of these dichotomies and naming power a bit by playing a reversal game. Instead of calling GIS a spatial technology, let's call it a spatial craft. Matthew Salesius describes craft as the history of which kind of stories have typically held power and for whom. So it is the history of which stories have typically been omitted, that we have certain expectations for what a story isn't or shouldn't include. Any story relies on negative space, and a tradition relies on the negative space of history. The ability for a reader to fill in white space relies on that reader having seen what could be there. Some readers are asked to stay always only in the negative. To wield craft responsibly is to take responsibility for absence. The same is true of the map. So are maps neutral? No. Maps make reality just as much as they represent it. Simply put, maps are power. They're not neutral, objective, or unbiased. Maps are active. Maps embody ideologies, and each map only represents a very specific viewpoint. Through story, maps have the power to make and unmake worlds. Maps reflect a specific set of power knowledge claims. I only look at the underbelly of the map. Locatable there is that which lives below the threshold of social reality. Rogue, unwatched, paradox enlivens the ontologically dead. A prefix is a portal. So what would it mean then to map the unmappable? Where might such a portal go? What kinds of world-building powers lies there? If you Google first maps, you'll see something like this. No bees, books, or carvings. What worlds are made and unmade here? What sits in the negative space? What common themes do you see here? Perhaps conquest, territory, land claims. So what is the relationship between maps and colonialism? If maps create reality just as much as they represent reality, then how have maps constructed a settler reality? Consider the word Cartesian, referencing coordinate systems, the language of the grid. Consider how the grid functions to create the legend of the untamed frontier by providing the requisite structure of land ownership. A grid simplifies large swaths of land into defined rectangular units to be easily parceled out into individual settlements for ownership. So how have maps produced elimination? How have they first produced the myth of emptiness that results in the very real removal and erasure of Indigenous peoples? Jim Keynote from the SUNY Countermapping Project says, more lands have been lost to Native peoples, probably through mapping than through physical conflict. This last December, I got to participate in Tzitzil's pottery show, an exhibit called History Became Legend, Legend Became Myth. His exhibit is a response to both the US to both the history and myths that are told about US expansion into the West. So utilizing the imagery and works of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, my little brother explored how the idea of manifest destiny is not only political, but also an idea physically depicted in art, utilizing clay as his medium for storytelling. My brother highlighted a similar movement of a dominating force from east to west between Tolkien's books and US history. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron is described as a great evil with the will to dominate all life. His expansion represented as a dark shroud that spreads from east to west. My brother notes that The War of the Ring reads like a post-apocalyptic story. Cities like Gondor or the world of the elves are all diminished by the expansion of evil. They become a fraction of their previous glory. For us, Native Americans living today, we have already gone through our apocalypse and survived. We are still here and ready to face what is to come. As part of a backdrop for his exhibit, he asked me to make a set of maps depicting the United States with the style of the maps used in the Lord of the Rings series. Look closely. Can you see the change? Too often, this wave of settler expansion of territory from east to west is romanticized as both peaceful and divinely inspired. But of course, this expansion came at the cost of the erasure of indigenous cultures and the destruction of millions of indigenous lives. Has it ever occurred to you what kind of violent histories hide within a place name? So maps as a world-building power isn't restricted just to the realm of fantasy. If maps have such powerful world-building and world-ending power, then how might you use that power to bring about real change in the world? In most of my mapping work, my home base is with Million Dollar Hoods, a project dedicated to documenting and mapping the human and fiscal costs of mass incarceration, primarily in Los Angeles. The first set of MDH maps were created by my mapping friends, Yo and Albert, who I'm sure many of you already know. This first map room documents and breaks down LA's nearly $1 billion jail budget by neighborhood, highlighting the neighborhoods where more than $1 million are spent annually on incarceration. These are LA's $1 million hoods. Our mission is to end mass incarceration. Our method is community-driven. Our strategy is data-focused. What kinds of myths are disguised as reality in LA's carceral landscape? What kind of alternative possibilities are obscured here? In some of my other presentations, I outline different critical cartographic strategies, different types of disruptions one can employ, ranging from projections, orientation, scale, the data itself, symbology, thinking of who the map maker is. But today I'll show you an example with just two and hint at a third. What is in the underbelly of your base map? What kind of assumptions lie there? A base map is a key relational aspect of your overall map. It sets the stage, the relational context for all the following layers built on top. When I see a base map like this, all I see is violence. One of my favorite quotes is from Tongva scholar Cindy Albitre. She says, "Creating a cartography of coyote space is an act of resistance. Coyote space is about making visible what others cannot or choose not to see. Arbitrary political boundaries become meaningless." Can you imagine what Google Maps might look like with a base map like this instead? Remember when we were talking about maps and colonization? Well, settler colonialism in particular is fed by the acquiring of land, and land is acquired through a logic of elimination, which erases Indigenous peoples and Indigenous relationships with the land in order to create empty space to be filled by settler ideologies. Recentering Tongva place names and relationships counters and disrupts settler logics of elimination. This critical place name swap at the base map level is a kind of temporal disruption. Indigenous peoples and Indigenous relationships to the land live in the here and now, despite often getting framed as part of a foregone past. Maps can have a healing power by putting back together things previously dismembered and erased and place them back in the present. The message: Indigenous peoples have always been here and will always be here. So what if this was the base map for MDH's map room? With Indigenous place names as the base map, what does this say about the relationship between land and policing? What kind of power lies there when it comes to decarceration? Something that I have often heard when trying to think of alternatives to incarceration, policing, and punishment is, I can't imagine that. If you're having trouble imagining something, consider if it's because certain forms of knowledge are missing. Consider how a lack of imagination may actually be a spatial problem. In what way do certain spaces exclude particular knowledge forms? Just as people are disappeared from spaces, what kind of knowledge disappears with them? Part of my responsibility as a data scientist is to ask, how do I create space for forms of knowing not usually recognized? My Diné sister, Grace Carson, a UCLA law student, says abolition means land back. The prison industrial complex and settler state are not permanent. There were no prisons on Turtle Island before 1492. And this is not to romanticize the Indigenous past. That narrative comes with its own set of harms, but rather frame carceral systems as a colonial imposition on Indigenous lands. There was a time here before prisons. Even if we struggle to imagine it, do you think the land remembers it? How might re-examining how we relate to the land open up different pathways of possibility? The MDH map room layer encompasses the monetary costs of policing, but are those the only costs? Of course not. So I started to play with adding the oral stories from community members impacted by incarceration, the residents of LA's million-dollar hoods. Not to add quantitative data, so to speak, but rather to disrupt the form. The auditory component transforms the map into one that physically speaks, one with many voices. Forget that creepy, disembodied scientist. I love maps because I love imagination work. In considering the role of maps in abolition or in any other kind of world-building work, what kind of counter-narratives and counter-imaginings do you wish to highlight? How can the practice of mapping lead to learning and unlearning and testing our imaginative capacities to play at science fiction in real time? The cartographic disruption I just showed you is one I'm currently using in MDH's newest project, Archiving the Age of Mass Incarceration, a critical memory project. Remembering a struggle for our history is a struggle for our future. Archiving the Age of Mass Incarceration is about turning mass incarceration into a future history. It's about mapping portals into the age of abolition together. Her shape haunts the maps drawn by his hand. She implies a different spatial and temporal geography of tunnels and time warps. She herself is not fully legible to colonialism's eye and cannot be defined by its sciences nor described through its grammar of power. Today, at the very, very beginning of my presentation, I brought a map with me that lives in a form that isn't often recognized. What world did I call in? Did you miss it? I also know a secret, one that's held in an archive. No, it's not in a building. There are no windows, nor walls, no climate control settings. When I want to talk about computational power, I go to Nashje. Did you know that the earliest forms of computation are basketry and weaving? Some versions of history will say that maps and technologies are a modern phenomenon, but they're not. We've been using maps, data, and technologies in the vast arrays of our co-resistance for far before the invention of the computer. And no, they don't need to be called data or technology to be valued. They have their own names. I dare you not to translate them. Whether it be the innovative infographics of W.E. Du Bois at the 1900 Paris Exposition, or the coded quilt patterns of the Underground Railroad of the early 1800s, or the intricate knots carried by runners that organized the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. We have always used our creativity and imaginations to construct technologies of resistance. To forget or abstract this only serves to maintain the illusion and myth of the settler state. We live in a world with many ways of knowing and many systems of knowledge. These systems are ancient, varied, and constantly in flux. And they're certainly not limited to Western or Eurocentric concepts of space and information, or even limited to humans. So shouldn't the way we think about and use maps or any geographic information system be the same? Maps are story, more than just numbers. They're deeply narrative and context-based. They take many forms. A map can be more than just a piece of paper or a screen. They can be a song, a dance, a prayer. Maps and data are not just a tool, but a relational practice, a way of describing relationships and an opportunity to identify and rectify imbalances, an incredibly powerful leverage point. So as you go about your mapping journeys, I have a couple questions and a challenge for you. So what lies in the underbelly of your map? What is myth? What is reality? To whose gaze? What worlds are created, destroyed, and reinforced in your map? And a challenge. Think of a map you've created, or next time you make a map, create that map again, but without points, lines, or polygons. Examining the underbelly of the map unlocks the power to make and unmake worlds, construct and deconstruct place, space, and even time. Maps hold the power of memory and imagination. Maps set yourself in relationship with other people, the world, and even the cosmos. Maps are a portal. So what world are you going to make? That's it. Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mariah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for inviting me out.
At the risk of sort of echoing here, let me. No, I just want to say this is, I hope, going to be really, really amazing for anybody who's going to be making maps tomorrow. I think this will, the point of the map making the hackathon tomorrow, I think in many ways is to take, everything that you shared here and kind of challenge us to sort of rethink the data that you're going to be given tomorrow and kind of make a map that really, tells something a bit more meaningful, kind of dives into that data, and you do something that you haven't done before. Thanks. I'm hoping that you're all excited to kind of take this and really apply it tomorrow, and not just make maybe a map with points and polygons, but kind of consider some other things too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how will the United Nations data package be delivered to everyone?
we'll be sharing that tomorrow, like through email and through in person. So
Yeah, you know, one of the keywords.
but do we have time for questions? Maybe if anybody has a question, would that be okay?
Yes, please. Yeah. And especially from the students who are participating. If
I
you
don't know
guys
if
have
anybody online or somebody in the room wants to kind of throw something out. Yeah.
Like, what would you recommend? I don't know if you can hear me, but.
Yeah, I'm gonna repeat it maybe.
All right, what would you recommend?
We can hear you.
To kind of help those deconstruct, because I think we already have really preset ideas of what these places are, and sometimes it can take an effort on us to say, okay, well, this was something else before, or this is something different. So that would be my question.
Did you hear some of that, right, or not? It's sort of like what kind of things would you recommend to look at to deconstruct
like, our preconceived ideas of what maps are.
Yeah, to deconstruct our own preconceived ideas of what maps are.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
one place.
Oh, and hold on, sorry, I need to.
Okay,
We have a volume issue here.
no problem. I think there's a couple different places that are good just to kind of exercise your brain in like looking at things differently. One place is a blog. It's also an Instagram account called the Decolonial Atlas. And that's one of my favorite places to go. Another place is called Guerrilla Cartography. And they have several different atlases that you can look at. On occasion, they have mapping events where you can participate. They used to have a Atlas in a Day challenge where you had a theme within 24 hours and then you had to create a map. I think the last one that I participated in with that was like about community. And so those are two places that are just good to, you know, look at things just from the get-go. The other places kind of once, because it can kind of take a while for your brain to just kind of like start, you know, really looking at things differently. But I just, you know, really challenge you to think of the ones that, you know, the maps aren't visual or like 2D, and really stretch your mind and think about like, okay, so what would a sound map actually look like or be like? And just really breaking that down with, you know, just like what contains like the spatial information in it and what's the type of relationship that's being, you know, put into place there. And then another really good one, which I think I have a copy on my desk. I'm not sure where I put it. It's a counter mapping atlas called Counterpoints from the, I think it's the Anti-Eviction Housing Project. They also have some really amazing maps there as well. So those are a couple of resources just to kind of get ideas and see how folks are putting it into practice.
I think we have a question in the chat from Maggie. Can you see that, Mariah? What authors and scholars?
Yeah, I think those three are the ones that I usually recommend the most. And there's definitely more out there, but those are usually my go-to ones. There's also the Zuni counter mapping project, which is on Emergence magazine. And that's really beautifully done. And I quoted Jim Minot, who's part of that project. That's also a really, really great one to look at as well.
Are there any other questions, maybe from the student body?
Right. Should I just yell?
Yeah, I think you can. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me? Oh wait, somebody typed something. We'll let them.
We can hear you actually really well.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I can project. So first of all, thank you so very much. I was texting another colleague. Emphatically, I was ready to jump up out my seat here. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us and with the students. I had a question about the neighborhood map that you created, the incarceration, I guess either for you and or Yo, since you know, and Albert, how did you come about kind of thinking to look at neighborhoods in that way? And I was actually kind of shocked at some of the areas that appear to have investment, or I'm not really sure if it was investment or if it's just that much money is spent on incarceration in those areas, and some of the areas were actually a little bit surprising to me. So I don't know if you could mention anything else about that.
Yeah, certainly. Yo, I don't know if you want to start with anything, or, you know, I can start talking about. I
You
know
can go
that,
ahead.
yeah, so I joined the team kind of after a lot of that was done, but, or that initial project was done, but a lot of the idea to come and look at like neighborhoods actually comes from $1 million blocks, which I can, throw a link in the chat. And so this was a project that, folks were inspired by, and just because of the differences in the landscape of LA, like with sprawl versus I think that original one was done, was it Chicago or New York? Do you remember, Yo?
Chicago was the first $1 million blocks project.
Yeah, and so you know, just given the sprawl that LA has, instead of looking at blocks, we thought to use neighborhoods. And so that's where that initial distinction comes from. And so and then the data itself comes from the LAPD. So we have kind of an estimated cost for how much it takes for just for like booking and everything like that. And so we'll use that in a calculation with the amount of arrests that happen in a particular neighborhood, and then calculate the costs that are associated with that. And it's outrageous, especially the more data that you've added on. Like cumulatively, it's over 9 billion from 2010 to 2019. And it's definitely concentrated in particular areas.
Thank you.
You know, I found the imagination idea so compelling, because I think when we talk about sort of prison industrial complex and kind of thinking about different ideas, I think that kind of project, the project that you shared, kind of gives us a sense of like reimagining in some ways of how this money could be used, right? And especially in the neighborhoods themselves. So I think it's so compelling, and I love that idea of sort of using our imaginations to kind of, you know, make these different types of maps, but also look at problems differently that are so sort of ingrained. Like it can't be any other way, like you said. But there was other ways. There have been times where there are other ways of sort of doing things. So and there is a question from Map Time. Do you want to put it in the chat, or do you want to unmute yourselves? Chatting, it's coming, I think.
I think they have the same, if they unmute, they can log in.
Yes. This question's gonna come out slowly, so we have the start. Yeah, I'm gonna let it all come out and then we'll. Oh, and it might just be just as simple as that. Are census blocks used for the $1 million hood project, or block groups?
Since I've been involved, we haven't used that level. Yo, I don't know if you have in the past.
Well, we summarize data to the neighborhood level. I mean, I haven't been for a long time either, but the neighborhood boundary is something that was really important for $1 million hoods, because as you all know, you don't know your census tract number, but you all identify with a neighborhood. So it's really critical to be able to say, hey, Boyle Heights has this kind of characteristics, as opposed to census block number this or that. So we made a conscious effort to use neighborhoods as something that people can relate to, but it's all summarized at that. So all the the numbers, the incarceration numbers, the tax dollars that were summarized at the neighborhood level.
And actually, can I interject? Because if I recall, the data came at the point level, right? So
Yes.
you actually
A
had
lot of it.
yeah, so a lot of the data is sort of point like longitude, latitude, and then that got sort of summarized at the neighborhood level. So it wasn't even coming
At each arrest.
at each house, like wherever the person was really like their home. Yeah, so it's so that's another really amazing part of this project too, is how the data that was sort of asked. I mean, one, I think the data was sort of requested through the LAPD. They weren't just giving it out, so there was some work there. And then the other piece is sort of being really sensitive about who is in the data. So it's all sort of anonymized. You don't actually know the people sort of summarized at that neighborhood level as well. So that's another sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of names there, obviously thousands and thousands of people in that data set.
There's a question on the mic.
I think there's a hand
There-
raised, Maggie.
Hi. Hi, sorry, I need a moment. Sorry. Hi Mariah. My name is Julius Gutierrez. I'm with the UCLA team, like we're all here. And I just wanted to say that I'm a big fan of the map that you showed for the $1 Million Hoods. And I really like the embodied aspect of you adding the oral histories. I'm in the MIS program here, the Masters in Library and Information Studies program, and I want to be a public librarian that does oral histories, like on the branch level. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciated kind of like the embodied idea of like land and history and how people hold knowledge. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your talk, and I hope to see you on campus.
Yeah, thank you for your comments and stuff. I'm actually virtual most of the time, but if you ever want to shoot me an email just to talk through things, and yeah, librarians are really you can do a lot as a librarian just in terms of critical intervention. So that's super exciting.
Any other questions? Hey, Mariah, you mentioned many words, but one that kind of stuck with me today was power. And maps are power. And I think in what we're going to do in the next couple of days, and what we've already done for some of us in the morning, actually early afternoon for you guys, is we need to recognize that every edit, every polygon we make comes with a lot of power. And not to take that for granted, because that building that you outline is actually somebody's house, and that comes with a lot of responsibility. So every edit that you guys have made this morning or this afternoon, and you're sending it to OpenStreetMaps, those buildings are being curated by a team called Hot OSM, and they then send it back out to the crisis region that you've been working on. So that's the power that you have. It's a lot of responsibility, and I just want to make the point that it's something we should not take for granted. So, and I was really touched by Mariah's presentation of power and how that power can disrupt, and especially it needs to send a message or a story to the people affected by that crisis to be able to improve their situation. But I wonder, Mariah, if you had any other words about that kind of message, as you say, maps equals power. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I tried really hard today to condense the presentation just into 20 minutes because I have a couple of different versions of this that I've developed over the years. But I think it's just really just remembering that it's never neutral, that it's always going to have an effect on the real world. And so it's really important to be in tune to, I think this is why I think of mapping as inherently a relational practice and thinking in terms of relationships. So it's not just what types of relationships are you representing in the map, But what types of relationships are embodied in the process of the map making in which you were doing, and what types of relationships are produced just by the map itself. And so, for instance, there's a lot of different dynamics that can happen there, but a lot of things that happen with data work is it translates to a kind of visibility. And visibility in data often translates to access to resources and rights. And so that can be really key in order for folks to get access for things. So another project that I sometimes will use in my presentations is I've worked with Cielo, which is a Indigenous woman-led organization in Los Angeles, mapping language, because there's this assumption oftentimes that folks south of the imposed border all speak Spanish, but that's not true. And a lot of the consequences of that assumption are often life and death, whether it's in police interactions or whether it's in the hospital or in courts, especially when you're talking about children. Not having access to interactions in your own language is a type of language violence. And so in order to counteract that, we created a map of all of these different languages. There were at least 17 different languages just from the survey that Cielo conducted. So that's just, a piece of what's actually out there. And that's really important just because there's this assumption, especially with Indigenous peoples, especially with Indigenous peoples within like the diaspora, that they don't exist. And so just that, being visible, that alone is really, really important. That being said, that same visibility can come with its own set of paradoxes, because visibility can also be really dangerous. So especially for folks who are undocumented, being too visible translates also to a really dangerous life or death situation. So it's about really being in tune to the types of relationships and power dynamics that are operating as you create your map. And so that's why in that map, we also use aggregation, this time to zip codes, as a type of, obscuring of location, so that there's like kind of safety in being aggregated at a zip code level, especially in a really urban environment that's densely populated. So that's an example that I think about, just thinking about what are the different power dynamics that are going on, because there's always all of these constant dynamics that are constantly moving. And I also find that the tactics and the disruptions that I choose to use when I'm making maps varies by time and place. Even like the maps that I was making for MDH at the beginning are different than the ones that I'm making now. The way that I talk about maps even changes depending upon who I'm with. And that just means just being really in tune with just different relational aspects and axes of power, because it's just constantly moving and constantly there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that was the best definition of GIS I've ever heard. I wonder if, is there someone on Maggie's camp that wants to have a question? Maybe just one or two more questions?
One of our students, Arisha, just put in the chat, is there any work on LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, and other school district policing initiatives and student susceptibility to incarceration in LA County, particularly geographically in resource isolated areas?
Yeah,
We have
absolutely.
some fabulous students here with great questions. So again, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely. We've actually had a couple of reports. I'm going to throw the link to the reports in the chat. Like we've had one that's just on policing our students. So that focuses on policing, and I'm just opening it up to see if it is, it's within the Los Angeles School Police Department, because LAUSD has its own police department in and of itself. So there's a lot of projects that have gone with that. There was also a project with the UCLA Cops Off Campus Coalition. And so that's definitely something that we're constantly looking at our work, is that, policing of youth, which is essentially a war on youth. And it's also something that we've integrated into the Archiving the Age of Mass Incarceration as one of the central themes that we see recurring over and over and over again. And historically, you see that with programs like DARE and other things. So yeah, that is definitely a recurring theme, and there's lots of different, I think, viewpoints into looking at that.
Great, thank you so much. Unless there's one final question, I think we can maybe call it a wrap here. I'm gonna give it 10 seconds. Anybody want to ask here? Going. Yes, we have a lot more mapping left to be done. Mariah, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your consideration, your time, and putting together that wonderful presentation. I have so much to learn from you. And I always learn something new from you every time you speak. So again, thank you from the entire 2024 Mapathon participation teams. And I hope to see you around.
And thank you for the conversation.
Likewise, thank you so much for inviting me again. And yeah, hopefully I'll stay in touch with you all. So happy mapping.
Happy mapping.
I'm actually just going to switch the host back to Andy so I don't actually close out anything.
Sorry
Okay, I just realized so.
Thanks.
So maybe want to start recording.